Lately, I've noticed a new trend in shows on some of the streaming services. Stories about men as soldiers, commandos, or vigilantes are nothing new. Violent television is nothing novel either, and I'm not holding myself up as a saint here. I enjoy some violent shows or books as much as the next guy. But more shows lately seem to feature women in these starring roles. And that does seem to be new, even as Congress entertains the possibility of a Secretary of Defense who, leaving aside his many other purported sins, has expressed opposition to women serving in combat roles. Graphic portrayals of women doing graphically ferocious things are increasingly in vogue. As you know, we've just concluded Hanukkah, a lovely holiday with chocolate gelt, glowing candles, and spinning tops. But there's an undercurrent of violence running through the Chag as well. Frequently, we focus on Matityahu and his 5 priestly sons, including Judah Maccabee, who bravely stood up to the Seleucid Greeks and reestablished a strong, if short-lived, Jewish monarchy in Jerusalem. Their victory of Rabim Biyad Me'atim, the few given to the hands of the many, or the many given to the hands of the few, rather, is captured in the Amidah's liturgical editions for Hanukkah. Bimei Matityahu ben Yochanan Kohen Gadol Hashmonai Uvanav, in the days of Mattathias, son of Yochanan the high priest, the Hasmonean and his sons, Kshe'amda Malchut Yavan Harasha'a al Amcha Yisrael, when the evil kingdom of Greece stood against your people Israel in order to make them forget your Torah and violate your laws, you and your enormous mercy stood up for them in their time of great need, upheld their cause, judged their case, and avenged their oppressors. Ve'al hanisim, ve'al haporkan, and for the miracles, and for the wonders, and for the mighty deeds, and for the salvations, and for the victories that you wrought for our ancestors in their days at this season, Bayamim hahem basman hazeh. But there's another lesser-known story related to Hanukkah, one that features a female protagonist and is celebrated on the penultimate day of the Chag, that is this past Wednesday, Rosh Chodesh Tevet. Rosh Chodesh is, of course, often associated with women, but the first of Tevet in particular is a Sephardi holiday, predominantly from North Africa, called Eid al-Banat, or Chag HaBanot in Hebrew, the festival of the daughters. According to the head of Research and Heritage Development of Israel's Culture and Sport Ministry, this ancient North African holiday was celebrated differently in various communities. In Tunisia, the celebrations entailed a collective bat mitzvah for all the girls turning 12 in the coming year. In Tripoli, in Libya, married women would convene and bless the single ones. In Thessaloniki, the women would ask for forgiveness from one another. And in Fez, in Morocco, families of engaged couples would light Hanukkah candles in each other's homes. These varying traditions are each lovely in their own way, but the source material varies from inspiring to fairly challenging. Why this day specifically? One reason is that the Megillat Esther says, and Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus in his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tevet, in the 7th year of his reign. Now, Purim takes place in spring, but Eid al-Banat falls on Hanukkah each year, so it's no surprise that ancient traditions arose associating the Festival of Lights with 2 women connected with the holiday that we've just concluded. One is Chana bat Matityahu, the daughter of Mattathias, who is said to have instigated the Maccabean revolt. The other, depicted by numerous Renaissance and Baroque artists, is Yehudit, Judith, and her beheading of Assyrian general Holofernes during the Babylonian period. This story appears in the apocryphal book of Judith, but a midrash places Yehudit later in the Hasmonean period. Here's a version of the story presented by the University of Washington's Strom Center for Jewish Studies. There was a time in Jewish history When the leadership of Israel was prepared to surrender Jerusalem to the Greek-Syrian forces of the Seleucid Empire, infuriated by their cowardice, Judith, a beautiful and righteous widow, chastised Israel's leaders for their faithfulness, informing them that God will deliver Jerusalem from foreign oppression. Feigning defection to the enemy camp, she adorned herself with golden robes, precious stones, rings, and bracelets, and scented her body with perfume. Upon seeing her beauty, the king was overcome with passion and said to his advisors, "Who will not go to war against them, that is Israel, for these women?" Judith cunningly arranged a night in the Greek king's tent. She fed him cheese and more wine than he'd ever consumed in his entire life. She then proceeded to decapitate him in his stupor, and graphically depicted in the text, slashed him over his entire body. Judith returned to the Hebrews, where she victoriously presented the severed head. The Greek military, now leaderless, fell apart. Judith then commanded the people of Israel to attack. When the Greeks found their headless king steeped in his own blood, one of his officers cried out a terrible shriek, "A single Israelite woman has brought about this horror." Violence. My interest today is not simply the pervasiveness of violence, but the glorification of violence. Judith, played by Zoe Saldana in the next Taylor Sheridan series. Violence, mostly not perpetrated by women, we should be clear, is all around us, isn't it? An exploding Tesla in Las Vegas, a terrorist attack slaughtering 40 celebrants and wounding dozens more on Bourbon Street in New Orleans. These were just two of the multiple violent headlines this week that ushered in the new year. But scratch the surface of so many of these violent incidents, and we find countless examples of those not only perpetrating violence, but those reacting to violence by minimizing or even celebrating these acts, by glorifying it. When Gilman alumnus Luigi Mangione assassinated United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson in New York, the internet exploded with snark and glee. Jokes like, "Prior authorization is required for thoughts and prayers," and "Does he have a history of shootings? Denied coverage," were everywhere. The frustration with United and the American healthcare industry is understandable, of course, but how easily so very many slid into dehumanizing language about the, let's be clear, premeditated erasure of a human life. Glorification of violence abroad. This week, the New York Times capped a 6-month investigation of Sudan's paramilitary rapid support forces, which have waged a brutal campaign of rape and slaughter reminiscent of the Janjaweed in Darfur 20 years ago. The mass executions and trophy videos documenting these grotesque acts share much in common with Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad snuff videos broadcast on Telegram during the October 7th massacre of Israelis in the Gaza envelope. And the Times, too, recently detailed Israel's decision to loosen its internal safeguards in the weeks and months following the Hamas attack. The piece does not draw an equivalency between Sudan and Israel, and I definitely would not. One is truly a genocidal campaign, and the other a war against a vicious enemy that brutalized and murdered 1,200 of our people and still holds 100 hostages. But wars must also be prosecuted justly. There are serious accusations that must be contended with, and I worry that Israel's current government, beholden to extremists and ideologues, is far from equipped to do so. There's been no serious state-led internal accounting of the war, government and intelligence failures, no real attempt to explain the policy change that the Times describes in light of Hamas's tactics, and either to justify it or to take ownership of the fact that maybe it was not justified. There have been, unfortunately, in the Jewish state, two presidents in the halls of Congress. That president-elect consistently celebrates violence, has long been accused of violent acts himself, and has pledged to pardon those who attack lawmakers and law enforcement on January 6, 2021. Oh, and by the way, I feel like a New York Times reporter today. If you haven't listened to the episode of The Daily in which Sabrina Tavernisi interviews Matt Flegenheimer, you should. The podcast considers the rise of so-called cage match politics and the influence of UFC CEO Dana White, the close friend and ally of Donald Trump. It's a fascinating and terrifying look at the so-called manosphere and the way many American men draw real comfort and inspiration from unbridled violence. At the end of the podcast, producer Olivia Nat asks a UFC, that's the Ultimate Fighting Championship for those who don't know, asks a spectator, why do you think the violence appeals to you? Quote, I just like how brutal it is, the man replies. It's different than boxing. And another says, it's very relaxing to me because of the violence of it. I could watch it every day. Now, truth be told, Hanukkah sits at the tension between violence and pronounced resistance to bloodshed. There's Al Hanisim, which we've already discussed, but the beloved hymn Maoz Tzur, despite its uplifting melody, is pretty brutal too. When you have prepared the slaughter for the blaspheming foe, then I shall complete with a song of hymn the dedication of the altar. That's the second half of the chorus. The last stanza, which scholars suggest may have been appended to the original, reads, bear your holy arm and hasten the end for salvation. Avenge the vengeance of your servant's blood from the wicked nation. But set in conversation with these lines is the Talmud's approach to Hanukkah. The rabbinic focus on the menorah, the miracle of oil, instead of the miracle of military triumph, seems a pretty clear response to the militarism of the Book of Maccabees, or the Book of Judith for that matter. Whether they were more concerned about depictions of violence or perhaps the internecine nature of the war is unclear, but in elevating the lamps, the rabbis diminished the war. By increasing the light, they decrease attention to the violence. Hanukkah holds both glorification of violence and its de-glorification. Which brings me at long last to our Parsha. Parashat Vayigash is a study in violence interrupted. The portion opens with Judah pleading with Joseph. He recounts the story that Joseph knows is a fictitious story about their brother who is Toraf, torn by a wild beast. Joseph listens to the tale, to the pleading and equivocating, Judah fighting for his brother Benjamin in a way he did not fight for Joseph himself. There's every reason for the cycle of violence to continue. Joseph is second to Pharaoh, ruler of the land. His brother's fates are in his hand, and with a wave of his hand, he could do away with those who did him so much harm, caused him so much pain. And then, he doesn't. He clears the room, reveals himself, and cries. His brothers are dumbfounded. How could this be? Ani Yosef achichem asher mechartem oti Mitzrayma. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And then, in a stunning act of grace, he says, do not be distressed or reproach yourself because you sold me to this place. It was to save life that God sent me ahead of you. Joseph had every reason to be angry. He had the power to act, but chose to walk away from retribution. However, we live in a time where politics and public discourse seem to celebrate the counterpunch. The meaner, the bloodier, the better. We doom scroll in the dark, we troll and stalk our enemies, often online, sometimes quite literally. Instead of reasoned discourse about the place of violence, the conditions in which it is necessary, we lash out or tear down. We're learning that the man who exploded his his rented Cybertruck in Las Vegas, who killed himself and injured 7 other people, did so after expressing support for a certain type of masculinity. And it seems blew up the Cybertruck in order to get the attention of his heroes, Donald Trump and Elon Musk. Hanukkah offers a cautionary tale, a tale of extremist regime that springs up in response to terrible violence. That regime turns on its own people and ultimately gives way to Roman oppression. But Jewish tradition offers another path, one interested not in retribution, but justice, one that glorifies not violence, but godliness, including when violent acts are necessary. Our liturgy recognizes the necessity of defense, but closes again and again with prayers for peace. So I think I'll do the same. Oseh shalom mimromav. May the one who makes peace in the heavens, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, help us find peace as well. V'al kol Yisrael, and for all of Israel, v'al kol yoshvei Tevel, and for the entire earth. V'nomar. Amen. Shabbat shalom.